In this video, we are going to learn about what are the strategies which we can use in case the dependencies array values change quite often, which means that they are changing frequently. So in this case, you can see that there is a set interval inside use effect, and it depends on count. It increments the count by 1 every time. So obviously it depends on count variable. Now you can understand that firstly why we are just using count. So if you remove count from dependencies array, then you can see that it is suggesting that it has a missing dependency count. But you can see that there are other variables also, right? So first of all, you should understand that what are the variables which you have to put in dependencies array. Dependencies array generally can have the variables which are from state or props, but uh, not something which is inbuilt. For example, set interval and clear interval in a sense is some value, but it is native JavaScript function, so they don't need to be here. Secondly, you might see that okay, let's say count is needed, but why set count is not needed? See, set count is also a variable. In fact, it's a function which is a setter for this count variable. And in this case, you will see that if I simply run this, then what is going to happen that since count is not as a dependency, then every time, then this thing is just running once at mount, and that's why you can see that when I refresh, then it goes to 1, and after that it is stuck at 1. And why is that? That is because when we are that is because when we are running it for the first time at mount, then the value at that point of time is 1, is sorry 0, and then 0 plus 1, this is continuously running, and every time it is setting 0 plus 1, though this function is running after every second, but every time it is just running 0 plus 1, 0 plus 1, because we know that the value is captured uh, at the time of render. So at the time when this function ran, that was the first mount. When the first mount happened, then this is effectively taking the values from that render. At that render, which is the first render, the count value is 0, and that is why 0 is captured, and every time 0 is only taking. So definitely we should add 0 here. Sorry, I meant that we should add count here. Okay, once we add count, then now you can see that the warning is gone. Okay, so now it works fine, because from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3, so every second the counter is changing. That is fine. But if you look at this carefully, then what is happening that so at 0, 0 plus 1, uh, 0 plus 1 is scheduled for 1 second. At 1 second, the value of count became 1, and count is in the dependency array, and that's why again this thing is running. But we know that whenever a effect runs, then its previous cleanup function also runs. So the previous cleanup function essentially clears the earlier interval, okay, which in the interval in which 0 plus 1 was set. Okay, now that interval is cleaned up just after 1 second, and then at t is equal to 1, a new set interval is scheduled with count value 1. So essentially after 1 second, which means that t is equal to 2, again count will change to 2, and at t is equal to 2, again this effect will run, because a count is changed now to 2. And now you see that again before running the effect, the cleanup of the previous effect will run, which will essentially clear the set count, which will clear the interval which had set count 1 plus 1. Okay, and now this that will be cleaned up, and a new set interval will be scheduled with count 2, which means essentially at t is equal to 3, that is going to set count variable to 3. So you can see that every second this thing is running scheduled and cleaned up just after 1 second, which means that essentially the purpose of set interval is not happening. So which means that even if you change set interval to set timeout, then also it will work fine, because actually the set interval is running just for 1 second. So if set interval is running for just 1 second, then you could have done simple set timeout also, and that also could have worked. So set timeout and clear timeout, clear timeout. If you do this and save and refresh, then you will see that this exactly works like that. Okay. So anyways, just wanted to show you that it will work like that also. But the idea is that the set interval is just used for 1 second. But how to solve this problem, that we need to run this every time? We are not taking the full advantage of set interval. What we can do is that, in fact, if you remove this dependency array, then React also gives you a suggestion that you can update this set count to a functional version of it rather than this actual value which you are passing to it. Which means that rather than passing count, you can use count arrow count plus 1. So now it is not, this count is not this, rather this is the current value of count. And now since this is a separate function altogether, so you can use it, you can use the name anything, C also, and you will see that now also it works perfectly in the same manner. But now there is a difference. The difference is that now the dependency array we have from that which was running the effect again and again, we have removed the dependency, which means that the same set interval which is scheduled at the first render, that is only running again and again after each second. But then also without using the count variable, this is running perfectly, because every time this function runs, it takes the current value and increments it, right? So it takes the internal value rather than taking an external dependency. So this is one of the ways in which you can avoid adding dependency too much. So you can understand that the only dependency was count, and we removed it in this manner. Specifically when that variable is a state variable, then you can use this trick to work around it. Okay, one more thing, that let's say I have some constant, let's say d is equal to 1 or 5, whatever the increment you want. So let's say 1 only, and I put d here. Okay, now still you see that it is not giving a warning that you have to add this dependency here, d, because React knows that d is constant. Okay, so it will not change, and that's why there is no point. So if you change it to, let's say, let, then it is again, it is not knowing that whether this thing is a should be added here or not. So if you know that it will be constant, let's try to move it to outside. Again, if it is outside, then also, even if it is let, then also the warning is not coming, because now React knows that this d is definitely not inside my. So the point is that whatever the variables inside the component is declared, and if they can change, then React will give you a warning that you should add it here, because React thinks that it will change and your effect depends on that thing, so you should rather add it here. Okay, so you can see that now the warning comes back, and if we know that it is not going to change, then that warning goes. Again, if it is let and you are changing it somewhere, then you should add that also in the dependency array. Okay, so yeah, and why set count? We already said that set count is not needed to be added here, because React ensures that this function identity is stable. What does this mean? This means that whenever the first render happened and whatever the set count was created, after each render count can change, but React ensures that set count never changes. Set counts identity is exactly the same. Set counts, whatever the memory address or whatever the place where it is stored, that variable is exactly always the same on each render. That React ensures, and that's why React does not warn you to add set count here. Okay, again, let's change back to just 1, and we'll see that it works perfectly. Now another situation can be, let's say this increment of counter is not happening here, rather it is happening somewhere here on the click of a button. So let's say there's a next button, and if you click this, then this thing happens, and here rather than incrementing here, we here simply have a, let's say, log where you actually count it, where you actually print the count. Okay, so now count has to be added to dependency array, but let's not add it now and let's see what happens. So you can see that every time 0 is printing. Now let's change it to 0 to 1 2, but then also you can see that 0 is only printing every time. Why? Because this effect, whatever is scheduled the first time, that time the count was 0, and that's why when this effect this effect essentially never reruns, and that's why the captured value of count, that is only after every tick, after every second, that value is only keeps on printing even if the count value actually has changed. Okay, so how to solve that? First way to solve that is that we can simply use count here, and then if we refresh, then we'll see that yeah, 0 0 0 is printing, but as soon as we make it, let's say 2, then you can see that now 2 is printing. We make it 4, then now 4 is printing. So you can understand that now it is working fine. But again, we get into that situation where every time the count changes, so from 0 to 1 whenever you did, then essentially the set interval is removed, earlier set interval is cleaned up, and a new set interval is scheduled, because that is how it has to be, because every effect essentially is taking the values from that render, that is attached to that render, and that's why the values which are inside the set interval are going to be values from that render. Okay, and that's why in the next render, when the count changes, then you need to change the set interval also, so the scheduled set interval, and in order to do that, you need to clean up the previous interval. So this works, but again, this is having the same problem. Right, earlier the problem was that on every tick it was changing. Now the only difference is that whenever you click, this thing is rescheduled and cleaned up. Okay, so how can we solve this issue? You can solve this issue by something called useref. We have already learned useref. It is sort of a field variable inside in the context of functional components, and we can store our data there, and then what can happen is that we can use the current value from that here. So our idea is that we will remove the dependency from here, okay, and we will not use count here, rather we will have some value, some ref, where actually the count value is there, and we will take current from there, and then we will print it here. So let's see. Firstly, let's use a value. Let's say I don't know, count ref is equal to use ref, and initially the value will start with count, and after that, whenever the count changes, I have to change my count ref also. So essentially it becomes something like this, that count ref dot current is equal to count. And now I'll talk about the dependency array, why not to use or use it, but for now, on every render this use effect will run, because I have not specified any dependency array, and then I can take this value and print it here. Okay, so what is happening, that this effect has dependency array empty, which means that this will only run at mount, which means the same scheduled set interval, the same scheduled function will run every after every 1 second. So on every tick this function will run, but even if this effect is only from the first render, then also it will always print the latest value. Why? Because I am not using the count variable directly, rather I am using the using the count ref. Okay, and this count ref, even though this is a local variable, but since this is not something like this let or something, or in fact even if you do let, this warning is not doing, because actually use ref returns a sort of again sort of a constant stable value, because React knows that whatever the modifications will happen to this ref object, that will happen on current only, right? So there is no need to re-render. In fact, you know that when props and state changes, then things change, then things need to re-render, this component needs to re-render, otherwise there's no need to re-render, right? There's no guarantee that when you change field like or refs like this, then things don't re-render, right? So this will work still fine. And now you'll see that when I save and refresh, then you'll see that 0 is printing, but when I change it to 2, then 2 is printing, and when I change it to 5, then now 5 is printing. So this is now working as expected. Now let's talk about why I have not added here any dependency array. So you can avoid that because yeah, this is not a big deal. Every time when this thing is rendering, then this effect is running, and even if count value has not changed, then also yeah, then also it has set, it is setting the same thing. But again, if you want to optimize it a bit, then you can add count here, okay, and this will also work fine. This will also work fine, right? But now you might ask that, yeah, what is the difference then? Just I have removed this count from here to here, okay, so how any difference? So it's just that I'm giving you a simple example here. A much complicated example can be there where lots of dependencies array can be there, right? Here it is much cleaner and much more predictable that what are you doing in this effect. In fact, I told you that even if you remove this dependency array completely, then also the entire purpose of this effect is to change the this count refs container its current value, okay, and that is only used here. So we have achieved essentially the removal of the count variable here, and in turn the removal of the dependency value from the dependency array. Okay, so in this way we can work around. So we saw a couple of ways, right? One, if set state or something is there, then use the functional way, or we can use this sort of count way. Otherwise we can use dependency array also. Now let me show you one another example where a similar strategy of using this sort of ref variables can be useful. So for that we need to have a completely different example where, let's say, instead of count there is some text, and we are setting text, and instead of just viewing it, let's actually make it editable using something like input. So let's remove it altogether, it's not needed. So there is some input text, and what happens, input field, and what happens that inside that value is this text. So don't bother, actually we have not discussed input tags, how to use form fields in hooks. We will discuss that later, but like normal React JSX, you can use value and you can use on change, okay. And what happens is that once you have decided that on whenever you are going to change, then you are going to call set state, and obviously it should not start with 0, it should start with empty string. And then whenever you change, then essentially whatever the event is there, that events target dot value you are taking and you are setting it, right? On the click of it, you are essentially going to, let's say submit. It's just a click anyways. So here what you can do is that you can call some function, let's say handle click, okay, and then you can define this function. So const handle click is equal to, and for now let's simply print this. So we are printing whatever the current text is there, okay. So now for now use effect or useref is not used, we will use it soon, but let's see. So now you can see that there is a input field and there is a submit button, and let's say you write anything, and then if you click on submit, then this thing is printed, right? However, if you see closely, then what is happening is that this handle click function which you are using here, okay, this thing is in fact created again and again and again every time. So this thing, why this thing is created again? Because it is using the variable anyways, even if you don't even if you don't even if you're dependent on any variable or not, let's say it is not dependent at all on anything, then also it will be created on every render. Why? Because it is as good as some variable, let's say const x is equal to 90. Okay, then every time this function runs, every time this variable is created. In a similar manner, this is also a simple variable which instead of a normal value like number or string, it is a function is also simply a value. So you can understand that like this variable is also created every time whenever this is rendering. So and at what times it is rendering, let's see this. So when you just click log and just have an arrow here, then you will see that as you keep on typing, you can see that as you keep on typing, this thing is rendering every time it is rendering, right? Why? Because every time I'm changing, every time I'm typing something, then I'm changing, then set text is being called. And again, this set text can be anything, right? So I don't know, like, again, I told you that this is just a thing. So variable, you can modify text also, you can use any name you can use, but the convention is whatever the variable of use, whatever the state variable is there, just set that variable. That is the general convention. But anyways, anything you can use. But the idea is that every time this set text is called and a new variable is set, new value is set in that state value, which means that text is changing every time whenever you are typing. Now whenever a state variable is changing, the re-rendering happens, and that's why whenever you are typing, re-rendering is happening. But a side effect of that is that whenever this re-rendering is happening, which means that this whole function is re-rendering again, then I told you that every time this will be created again and again, which means that this thing is created again and again every time. Let's say I want to avoid that. If you remember, we already have a function for that, in order to memorize functions, and for that we use callback. Okay, so we can use callback, and inside that we can essentially pass a dependency array. And what will be dependency array? Dependency array will be whatever the value you are using here. Okay, so that value, you can see that text, so it is saying that you should use text as a dependency array. And now what happens that yeah, you have created a memoized version of it, but still it is not of much use. Why? Because essentially whenever I'm typing, then text is the only variable which is changing. Again, text is the variable. So even though you are trying to memorize it, but essentially every time again this re-rendering, again not re-rendering, essentially this callback was supposed to memorize, but you know that callback is supposed to memorize in general, but it again overwrites the memoized value when the dependency array value change, and text value is changing again and again on every click of inside input, on every type of new character inside input. And that's why this memoized value is not giving us like much value. It is not doing its work correctly. Means it is doing its work correctly, but in our context text value is changing, so it is basically rewriting again. So we did not get much advantage by just using callback. Okay, use callback. So what to do? Somehow we have to remove this dependency of text and still be able to get the latest value. Then this is where the use ref thing comes into picture, that if we create a field sort of variable and create a reference where we can store in that container, we can store the text, we can update that continuously. But essentially we remove the dependency from here, then this function will not be created again and again. Okay, so what we can do, we can simply create something like text ref is equal to use ref, and then we can start with the initial value of text. That is fine, but after that on each render I can just update my text. That's it. Sorry, not use ref, rather use effect, and inside that on each render I just need to change my this value, which means that I'm updating this. But now I can just remove the dependency from here, and here I can directly use this value. Okay, so now you can see that behavior is exactly same. Whatever you are typing, that thing is printing, which means that the value inside the value captured inside the handle click is still the latest value, but now you can see that this is not created again and again. I'm using callback, and the dependency array is this thing, which means that the function created is from the original render only, the first render only. This function is not created again and again, but the value which I'm using is a reference value, right? And that value I'm updating here again and again. So here I'm trying to avoid the having the cluttered dependency array, right? And now it looks again simple, that yeah, you know that here it is rendering again and again. In order to optimize here, you have to write text, that is fine. But now you can understand that even if you remove from here, then also it works fine, and moreover it's cleaner. But here this function can be much more complicated, and if this function is being created and again and again, and you want to optimize that, then you can optimize like this. Okay,